Seems to me we're reliving the 1920s, and we know where that led. Seems to me. All right, so I'm reading this book, Edward Chancellor, The Price of Time. I'm on chapter 6 now. Good book. Enjoy it very much. I was made aware of it by an interview that the Mises Institute did with Chancellor, the Austrian magazine I get from the Mises Institute. So that's, I like this. So I bought it, and you can see I bought it here on February 3rd. It was published August 16th, 2022, and only 294 ratings. So I hopefully get more ratings. I'll rate it when I'm done reading it. But anyway, I tell you, man, it's nuts. All right, so the first thing we're going to start with is right after World War I, inflation hit hard in the U.S. As always does. Wars always bring inflation. Devastation, death, inflation. War is evil. People promoting war are evil. No two ways around that. All right, so what the Federal Reserve wanted after that was stable prices. That was their number one thing, stable prices. That's the Federal Reserve. Their whole point of existence was for stable prices. And so we're going to start here on page 87. Stable prices were what Benjamin Strong, who was a Fed Reserve chairman at that point, not a good guy, by the way, was stable prices was what Strong wanted, and stable prices what America got. Between the end of 1922 and 1929, the index of the U.S. consumer prices scarcely budged, so stable. So, in the absence of inflation, the American Central Bank was able to adopt a less restrictive policy. From the summer of 1924, the Federal Reserve engaged in large-scale government purchases. They bought $500 million of bonds. Now, that seems like a freaking chump change now, but back then it wasn't. So they bought the bonds, and what do you do when you buy something? You issue cash. So they're issuing cash, the currency, to flow into the U.S. economy. And what does that do? It means there's more cash to lend, which means the interest rates go down. When you're selling bonds, you're taking cash out of the economy, which means there's less cash, and that means cash is scarce, which means the interest rates go up. When you're loose with it, you're putting cash into the economy, which means cash is abundant, which means the interest rates go down. I know it's kind of tough to think about, but just remember, when you're the purchasing of bonds, I'm buying, we'll say this is a bond, I'm buying this from you, I'm giving you cash to the bank, essentially, and the bank can then use that cash to loan out. And because there's more cash available, the bank doesn't have to charge as high as interest rates. It means it's loose on the interest rates. And that's exactly what happened here. Interest rates sharply fell. By September of 1924, the discount rate was 3%, a decline of 1.5 percentage points over the previous year. Crazy. Calvin Coolidge on the campaign trail said, "It's a policy of this administration to reduce discount rates. We want low interest rates." So from 1924 to 1928, bank credit in the U.S. more than doubled. Much of this lending was not employed by industry because commercial loans actually decreased, but went to finance stock loans, real estate mortgages, and the purchase of foreign securities. Interesting. Purchase of foreign securities. Strong feared that if they raised the interest rates, that raising interest rates to curtail margin loans would produce collateral damage. And it is strong. I think the conclusion is inescapable that any policy directed solely to forcing the liquidation in the stock loan accounts and concurrently the prices of securities will be found to have a widespread and somewhat similar effect in other directions, mostly to the detriment of a healthy economy. We don't want to raise interest rates because if we do, and that does take speculation from the stock speculators, they're going to get their butts handed to them, and that could have huge detrimental effects in the overall economy. Remember, prices were stable at this point, too. Consumer prices. The companies weren't borrowing the money. The commercial lending went down. All of that money was going to real estate and stock loans and foreign security purchases, which we'll get into. And this is how cocky these clowns were. Andrew Mellon said, 1927, I think, "We are no longer the victims of the vagaries of the business cycle. The Federal Reserve System is an antidote for money contraction and credit shortage." Okay. Yikes. Let's keep going. I'm going to throw a curveball because while the interest rates were low and the economy was booming, you can't really make an argument that consumer price inflation was stable. You can't make an argument that the Fed was doing something wrong. You just can't. Here's why. The 1920s were a period of remarkable productivity growth brought about by electrification. Yep. And other new and improved technology known as Ford technologies, assembly lines and whatnot. Between 1923 and 1928, the U.S. economy grew at nearly 8% a year. So again, we have electrification, increasing productivity, which kept the prices low. It wasn't because the interest rates are low. So what happened was, this competing thing. You had huge advances in productivity because of electricity, and then over-the-road trucking, as I'll talk about in my soon-to-be-released book. Don't you worry, my friends, soon-to-be-released book. You could bring products to market, but previously you could not do that. But then electrification, 100%. And so those productivity gains, they reduced in terms of the inflation that would come up with loose money, because they said, man, I just literally in my book I talked about how Carrie Myers talks about, and I don't have the books in right here. Elmo would have to go to Rockford Lake in the middle of the wintertime to dig up ice to put in his ice house. No more you need to do that with electrification. Huge productivity gains. So those productivity gains were able to keep the prices level, even though the interest rates were way low. It's interesting. I have that now. Just FYI. All right, let's keep going. So again, we already talked about how the consumer markets, much of the new lending, because all the new lending that was out there wasn't for industry, it was for three things: stock loans, which is not necessarily the case today, real estate, as definitely the case today, and foreign securities. And here's where we're going to get a little bit interesting what's going on today. Relatively low interest rates in the U.S. spurred massive outflows of capital to countries which offered higher yields. Hold tight for that. Again, I'm going to repeat this. Relatively low interest rates in the United States spurred massive outflows of American capital to countries at higher yields. Now, that's not the case today. In interest rate, we are still chief. We have the highest interest rates in Europe, higher than, I don't know what China's doing, but China, come on. We have the most alluring interest rate market, because even though the interest rates have dropped quite a bit in the last month or so, they're still very attractive for foreign nationals. That's a fact. So that's a little bit different, but I hate to, because I make this comparison. Right. Let's see. American dollars that flowed abroad to acquire foreign securities were, in turn, spent by foreigners on U.S. exports. And back home, consumer spending was held up by installment credit. He's got a typo in here. Page 91, Edward Chancellor says, installment is 2 L's. I think he's got 1 L, installment. Installment credit and stock market profits. Speculation in real estate and stock investing was growing rapidly. A very considerable part of the supposed income of the people, which was sustaining our retail and other markets, was coming not from wages and salaries, but rather from the capital gains on stocks, bonds, and real estate, which men were treating as ordinary income and spending an increasing degree on luxury. All right. But I just want to go back to this again. American dollars that flowed abroad to acquire foreign securities. Why were they acquiring foreign securities? Because the interest rates on the foreign governments were higher. Germany, for example. Brazil, for example. I don't know about UK. I don't know. What does that remind you of? Well, not now. But you know what it does remind me of? So those outflows of foreign dollars were going to buy foreign securities. Those foreigners who received that dollars then used that money to buy U.S. products. They imported, we exported. So what's happening now? Not relatively low interest rates in the United States spurred massive outflows of American capital. The high value dollar spurs massive outflows of American capital to foreign countries with cheap goods we buy. So what happens? So literally this is what happens. The American dollar is so much more valuable than the Chinese or Ethiopian or Vietnamese, whatever. So what happens is we take our money and we say, look, We can buy a refrigerator manufactured in freaking, I don't know, Appleton, Wisconsin for $3,000, or we could use that same dollars and buy that same refrigerator manufactured in, Shangju. What's that place called? Chongdong. I did a book on that book, an article, paper in college. I can't remember. Chongdong. I'm drawing a blank. Guangdong, China for $1,000. Well, we're going to use our $3,000 and buy that refrigerator from Guangdong. We're not going to buy it local because it's too expensive, and they're roughly the same manufacturer. So now our money goes to China. All right, they have $1,000 of U.S. dollars. What do they do with it? Well, our interest rates are much higher than their interest rates relative to credit quality, so they buy our bonds. We buy their goods with dollars, they buy our bonds with dollars, and we are back to having our dollars back. To buy their goods, they buy our bonds. You see this cycle? Let me draw it out for you. So start with U.S. dollars. All right, starting here. U.S. dollars buy Chinese product. All right, so that's the flow. U.S. dollars buys the Chinese products. Some of that money flows to a more of a middle class in China, but not much. So then China then goes to buy U.S. bonds. And so what happens is our money goes to China for their cheap products, and then our money comes back to us by buying our bonds. And then what happens? We have that cash money, and the circle keeps going. It's just goes zooks, 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 zooks. And the game keeps playing. What was happening in the 1920s? Relatively low interest rates in the U.S., the U.S. dollar would go buy high yield bonds in foreign countries. Same thing. It's a capital outflow. Our money is leaving the country to go where it's treated better, essentially, i.e., in terms of this case, buying higher interest rates bonds in Germany, Brazil, all over the world. What did those foreigners do with that money? They bought U.S. goods. And what happened then? We got our money back, and again, we went and used that money to buy high-yielding bonds from foreign countries. I mean, it's just the way the machinations, if that's the right word, of the system works. The free market enterprise, the globalism. The problem now is we don't have cheap goods to buy anymore. The manufacturer, our exports are. I mean, we still export stuff like liquefied natural gas. We export for sure. You know what I'm saying? Absolutely. Insanity. We do export wood for biomass, which is insane. Virgin forests being cut down for the UK to say they're renewable electricity. It's insanity. But we do export some stuff, mostly on the energy front, because they don't have the ability in the UK and whatnot to produce their own LNG. And they don't want to buy from Russia, so they get from us. But anyway, the same thing's happening. As we're moving our money to foreigners, in this case for cheap goods, those foreigners are now buying our bonds and allowing us to buy more of their product. Okay, and that works until it doesn't. That works until it doesn't. And we know it didn't. The bubble popped. In fact, here we go right here. In 1928, National City Bank sold bonds on behalf of the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais, despite an internal report highlighting basically that they're corrupt. And yet nearly 2/3 of those bonds later went default. So how long can the money flow with cheap goods? As long as the cheap goods flows and America has higher interest rates, the money will come back to us. But that's not a strong economy that's built on exporting our money and importing cheap goods. That's not. In fact, that is built on, just like what Chancellor was saying, the previous generation was they were buying their money. They were buying their money. It went to finance stock loans, real estate mortgages, and the purchase of foreign securities, or in this case, the purchase of foreign goods. That's not strong in terms of the ability to maintain a prosperous economy. It's just not, because the manufacturing is being destroyed, dude. And it's just a fact. We still manufacture stuff. Don't get me wrong. We still got a big manufacturing footprint, but shrinking by the day. Anyway, the point being is, at some point, you, you have to have a growing economy. And back then it was growing at 8% a clip because electrification. What's happening to make this economy growing? It isn't. On top of that, the manufacturing process, what's happening? Is being dwarfed. Interest rates are going down. People are buying our bonds still because we're still the strongest economy out there, and we will be for many, many years. Don't get me wrong. It's not like it's going to fall overnight. I mean, even the American economy, the Great Depression, didn't fall overnight. Still, 75% of people had jobs. Vast majority of people were not even affected by the Great Depression. Some people were. But your stock portfolio got hit hard because it was built on speculation. It can crash by speculation once the days of the easy money go away. I don't know what's going to happen, or if it will. I don't know. But it seems a lot of reminiscence to 1920, and we led into 1930. Anyway, so you always want to be on guard. All right, love your thoughts. We'll see you.